The Vice President of the United States of America, James David Vance, gave an interview on National Broadcasting Company News and said one of the key phrases that was instantly picked up for headlines: Russia has made significant concessions. And then Vance goes on to say that security guarantees for Ukraine will have to be discussed with the Russians. Vance listed that Moscow has abandoned the idea of installing puppets in Kiev and acknowledged that Ukraine needs security guarantees. And in general, the Russians admit that Ukraine will de facto retain its territorial integrity. And in Vance's opinion, these are huge concessions for Moscow. But I don't know if you can say that this sounds optimistic. Nevertheless, at the same time, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs repeats that a meeting between Zelensky and Putin is only possible with some kind of prepared, proper agenda. Security guarantees for Ukraine without Russia are pointless. So let's calmly figure out exactly what J.D. Vance said, what it could mean, and where the political trick or political packaging is here. So let's break down J.D. Vance's statements word for word. Where are the contradictions with Ukraine's position? Where are the contradictions with Moscow's position? Why does the White House need to show movement? And why does this movement make sense for Kyiv? Only when there is a clear understanding of security guarantees and any veto right from Moscow disappears. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is August 24th, Independence Day, on the calendar for our beloved Ukraine. Next, everything in order. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, write any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So Reuters reports that J.D. Vance stated that Russia has made significant concessions. That's why he's surprised Ukraine hasn't agreed to what is basically a surrender. In particular, he acknowledged the futility of the puppet regime in Kiev and the very fact that Ukraine needs security guarantees. Vance added that this is a turning point after 3.5 years of war. Short and clear, 3.5 years of full-scale war. Biden mumbled something and couldn't get such serious concessions from Kyiv, but Donald Trump did it all quickly. There you go. Well, you know. It's important to understand that this is being said by the Vice President of the United States, who will most likely run for President of the United States in 2028. He says these are concessions, significant concessions. Where's the contradiction? The Russian Foreign Ministry maintains its stance, saying no meeting between Zelensky and Putin is planned. Putin is willing to meet when an appropriate agenda is set. Security guarantees should be discussed with Russia involved. So Moscow wants, the key to the lock called post-war security of Ukraine, so that, they can open and close that very security for our country at the right moment. And Moscow states this directly, that they want to have the right to veto any post-war security for Ukraine. You can write down whatever you want, but give us the right to veto, and we will agree to it. That's a utopia. Well, that's not a concession, that's a maneuver. And this position is regularly reiterated by the same head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Lavrov. So let's put two pictures side by side. The Kremlin, 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 the Kremlin. It was the armed forces of Ukraine that showed the unwashed Russians that these dreams should be abandoned. This isn't Donald Trump's achievement. And yes, the word guarantees is now being used in Russian conversations as a pretext, as an excuse to sell it as a shift in position, as a concession. When they discuss security guarantees for Ukraine involving Russia, it's not a guarantee but a tool Russia seeks to gain influence after the war. Kyiv won't agree to such guarantees because that's Budapest 2, that's Minsk Agreements 3 and so on. Only with the stop button in Moscow. Why does the White House need this presentation? Why does Jiggy Wentz embarrass himself claiming significant concessions from Moscow? Now they don't want Otmorini, or rather the regime in Moscow, in Kiev, is ready to agree to security guarantees for Ukraine. Wentz forgets that this is a doomed country, attacking its neighbors, attacking bloodily, attacking unprovoked. It starts the biggest war since World War II, kills a lot of people, kidnaps children, rapes and kills civilians, for example, in Bucha, in Mariupol. After all this, UN says that Russia is giving in and that we'll have to agree. Why does the White House need this? That's how it's presented. For the American domestic audience, it's necessary to show that Donald Trump's pressure is working and that the American president's plan is putting pressure on Moscow, and Moscow is starting to give in. UN directly talks about significant concessions to weave a sense of progress into the agenda. This is normal politics. Sadly, it's dirty but typical. If negotiations are dragging, manage expectations. What matters to us is that concessions are only real in the guarantees text where the aggressor lacks veto power. That's what's important. Without all of this, it's just pretty packaging. Why should Kyiv, not argue with this rhetoric, but stay firm? There's no need to get into a debate with JDUNs because every public word of JDUNs can later be nailed to the table. Well, look, you said yourself that Moscow acknowledged the security guarantees. It's different when Lavrov says it versus when the United States Vice President says it. Great, then here is the text of the security guarantees. Please, without Russian law. This is the text. We developed it together with the Europeans. Awaiting confirmation from Donald Trump. You say everyone agrees. Here's the document. No need to rewrite it, just sign. That's the point of public policy. To draw out, I'll put it bluntly, to draw out your opponent into making a statement and then turn those statements into conditions. This is something that Ukrainian diplomacy also needs to work on. There's no need to attack or explain anything to JD Vance. No, there's no need. He said that everyone supported the security guarantees. All right, we are developing them together with the Europeans and providing them to you. And then, if you've taken on the role of the one applying pressure, you put pressure on Moscow. And here it's very important that Ukraine has already pushed through 2 points. These are security guarantees for our country, like NATO Charter Article 5 and the sanctions snapback. If Russia violates anything, sanctions automatically return without debate. About deadlines. While Vance is saying that there are already concessions, Trump is simultaneously setting a 2-week deadline and promises to change his tactics. Well, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation responds that the agenda for the meeting between Zelensky and Putin is not ready. This triangle explains why the concessions look like just words. The key is in the pressure tools, secondary sanctions, hitting oil revenues, shipping insurance, a complete shutdown of Russia's shadow fleet, long-range missiles for Ukraine, and so on. If Ukraine doesn't have this, then any so-called concessions from Russia, which JD Vance voices to us, don't dissolve. If all this is set, good, there's a security guarantee, we need to use it. We must also realize that JD Vance's words have meaning. It's a kind of political hook, one that can be used to carefully catch Moscow. If everyone says Moscow accepts Ukraine's security guarantees, then develop and sign them. JD Vance says we will need to discuss them with the Russians. Yes, no problem. When they're ready, you can show them to the Russians, shove them in their faces, and say, here they are. Then JD Vance will later ask, how did this happen? I said Putin agreed to security guarantees, but now Moscow is setting conditions again. How is this possible? But as long as any formula includes Russia's participation and so on. This is not a serious concession. This is a veto right. This is Moscow's attempt to get a veto right. We're working on 2 fronts, economic pressure and long-range missiles. We're also drafting a strict guarantee text that triggers protection without Moscow's approval. Then that will truly be a breakthrough. And then JD Vance will be the one who did well, who turned out to be right that the security guarantees worked. But that's the kind of rhetoric we're hearing from Washington right now. Obviously, they need to show their domestic audience that there is progress, that Trump's pressure is working, and that Moscow is making concessions. It's important to note that if they don't say this, Trump seems like an empty shell. So I'll leave it at that. I urge you not to react too sharply to James David Vance's statement. Nevertheless, share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's it for now. Take care. Goodbye to everyone.